Hi everybody, it's Cheryl with Silver Sage Studio, and today I'm going to show you how I turn this thrift store tray for $4.99 into this tray here that I absolutely love. Now, even though I love it, I made lots of mistakes along the way, and I'm going to share my mistakes with you so that you can learn from me. So I'm starting off here by cleaning off the price tag, and I'm going to also wipe everything down and get all the dust off of that tray. Now I'm going to be using some silicone molding. I'll link everything in the notes below, and I'm going to use this along the edges because I'm going to be using resin. And this molding will protect the resin from leaking out through the cracks. Now this brings me to my first mistake, which was not being neat with the silicone molding. I just kind of slapped it on there. I should have gone back with the spatula and tidied that up because it's really going to show later, and we'll talk about that a little bit later here because once I spray paint it, those bumps and lumps are going to become pretty darn obvious. I thought it was going to be covered with the resin, but it's not. Now that brings me to my next mistake, which is that I took off the foam feet on the back. I had a reason for doing this, which was the spray paint. I thought it was going to harden them, and it didn't. So next, I here am going to be spray painting. I'm using this Krylon spray paint. It worked out really well, except that with my first mistake with spray painting is that I spray painted in the wind. And you'll see here that it was really a hassle for me. I had to keep holding down my newspapers. Now, I live in an area that's windy all of the time. There's really, no way around it. It's pretty much going to be like this any day of the week. So really what I wish I had done is I wish I had done this spray painting in a garage with the door open so that it was still ventilated, but maybe at least a little bit more of a protected area. Not only did I have to keep holding my paper down, but, little things were flying onto the spray paint and getting stuck. And it was just really, honestly, kind of irritating. But also irritating was that I really didn't position myself well, and I ended up breathing in some spray paint. This is a bad idea, people. It's not good for you, so be careful. Now, I'm going to go ahead here and mix my resin. So I'm starting with my supplies. I end up never using these cups, so I'm sorry I'm wasting your time with showing you them, but I had them out. This is a silicone cup that I use for measuring, and it's got measuring markings on there, but you can't see them, so I'll show you what I do with that. And I'm using some mica powder. I want it to be a cream color, so I'm going to use that white along with this antique gold to mix it just a little bit and warm it up. You need to have a level whenever you're working with resin. And by the way, if you don't have a level like this, you can download apps on your phone that work just well. This cup is a mess. It's ugly. It looks bad, but it's actually a good cup. I'm using here art resin. I have a whole long reason why I use art resin, and I'll probably do a whole nother video on that, but it's food safe and it's just really good quality resin. And so I'm going to go ahead and use art resin. I'm using the measurements that they gave me, which I'll talk about later, but I'm starting here with the actual resin. So resin comes in two parts usually. It comes with the resin itself and the hardener. And here what I'm doing is marking where I'm going to measure with a Sharpie on the outside of my silicone cup, because you cannot see on there the measurements. They're embossed kind of on there, but you cannot see them, especially once you get resin in there. So I just usually figure out where I'm going to do it and then mark it, and it makes it so much easier to measure. So with art resin, you measure equal parts in measurement of resin to equal parts in measurement of the hardener. And so right now I'm measuring out that resin, and you want to get all of that resin out of that cup because you want to make sure that you're not leaving too much in there and affecting then the measurement of the hardener, because you really do need to have equal parts. Once you get that in there and get it measured, both sides, both the resin and the hardener, then you need to stir it for 2 minutes. Art resin says 2 minutes. I'll be honest, I usually do 3 to 4 minutes, and I usually end up with lots and lots of bubbles, probably because I'm mixing as much as I am. But in my experience, when I stick with the 2 minutes that art resin suggests, I sometimes end up with areas that haven't been mixed well and they don't cure, and you have a ruined project. And I didn't want this project to be ruined, so I stuck with my typical 3 to 4 minutes of stirring. As you're stirring with the resin, you want to make sure that you are scraping along the sides of the cup and also the bottom of the cup occasionally, so that you're getting anything that might be stuck to those and getting it mixed in, because again, you want to have a good mixture so that it cures appropriately. Now, I wanted my resin to match the color of the spray paint that I used. So I'm going to be mixing in some mica powder here. Now, there's other things that you can use to color resin, but I'm using mica powder, and I'm going to use white and gold, and that gold is supposed to warm it up and give it that cream. But my mistake in my coloring is that I was really not careful, and I ended up putting in way too much of the gold and ended up really with a gold color, and it ended up just being so not what I wanted that I went ahead and just dumped that whole cup of resin. Now, resin ain't cheap, my friends, so you want to make sure that you're being careful. So as you can see here, I'm starting all over again with my resin. I really honestly could have used that resin that I had mixed and made a coaster, but I really didn't want to mess with it, so I just went ahead and started from scratch. So I'm going to play this fast forward and let you watch me mix my resin, and I'll be back in a minute. This time around, I was really happy with the color of my resin. It matched really well. So one thing I want to point out is I'm using gloves here. You always want to use gloves when working with resin. It's not good. We don't really know what it does when it gets on your skin, and some people say they develop allergies after exposure, so wear gloves when you're working with resin. So here I'm using the level to make sure that my tray itself is level. If it's not level, you know, resin is self-leveling. So if something is off level, it's going to all sink to that side. So you really want to make sure it's nice and flat. Now, my next mistake I'm going to talk about here is that I really did not mix enough resin. And what happened was, art resin is originally designed for artists who want to put a clear, glossy coat over their artwork. So painters, for example, who want to do that. And so if you go to their website, you can get the measurements, put in the measurements of your artwork, and it'll tell you how much resin to mix. And that's what I did. But boy, I barely had enough to cover this. And I really wish I'd had a little bit more to work with. So what I'm going to do is get it spread out. I'm going to spread it out as much as I can with that popsicle stick. And if you kind of move the resin with the popsicle stick, then it'll kind of move itself a little bit better when you're tipping it. Before I do that, I'm hitting it with the heat gun. The heat gun does a couple of different things for me. Number one, it's going to pop your bubbles. And that's really important because, well, you don't want bubbles in your resin, right? That's why I don't worry so much about over mixing the resin and getting bubbles, because I know I can hit it with the heat gun. There's other tools you can use. Again, that's for another video, I think. But the other thing that happens with the heat gun is that it does liquefy the resin a little bit better so that it moves around a little bit better. So even though I'll sometimes hit it with the heat gun once I've moved it around, it can really help you get that resin spread out when you're working with a surface such as this. another round with the heat gun gets all of those bubbles out. And you can probably see here along the edges where my unevenness with that silicone is really frustrating me. Once you've got your resin set, you need to cover it so that dust and, in my case, dog fur, which seems to float everywhere in my house, doesn't land on your final project. But I made the mistake of coming in and moving things, and I ended up with some dog fur on my resin. You can see I'm touching it right there. There's dog fur on there. Once it's hardened in there, my friends, it's not coming out. So don't be like me. Don't be antsy. Cover your resin up. I used a box top and had to layer another thing on top of that to get the whole thing covered, and walk away for 24 hours. You do not want to take that cover off for 24 hours. You also don't really want to do anything with it for 48 hours. That's my rule. But anyways, I'm chatting along here to you with my hands and ended up deleting that audio, so I'm just going to cut it off here and move to the next step. Okay, my next layer is going to be a vinyl die cut that I cut using my Scan and Cut onto this gold vinyl. It says Celebrate, and it's got stars and little bubbles all around it. I actually bought the actual cut file itself from Etsy. Now, if you don't have a Scan and Cut or a Cricut or a Silhouette, all is not lost. If you know what you want, there are a lot of shops on Etsy that will create a custom die cut for you and ship it to you. So I will link below to a couple sites that do that. But what I'm doing here is situating my die cut. Now, my next mistake was not having reading glasses nearby, and it took me forever to do some of this, and I eventually remedied it by going and getting my reading glasses. But if you're like me and you're approaching, middle age or beyond, as some of us are, make sure that when you're doing something like this, you have your reading glasses. So right now I'm doing what we call weeding. If you already work with vinyl, you know that that's what it's called, but for those of you who haven't worked with it, it's called weeding, like you're weeding the garbage out of your yard. And I'm just going to be completely honest with y'all here. I am not a vinyl expert. I'm still pretty new to vinyl, so I'm not trying to teach you all like the ins and outs of vinyl. I'm just going to go over what I did. So my next step, once I've done all that weeding, is to get the transfer tape placed down. And so that brings me to my next mistake, which is not taping my sheet down. You'll see here that I really fussed and fought with this and eventually just got smart, and I taped that vinyl sheet down so it would lay flat and I could put the transfer tape on it. So I get that vinyl tape down and I get the transfer tape placed onto it, and then I engage in my millionth mistake with this project, and that was not really using the right tool to scrape it down, both here when I'm trying to get the transfer tape flat, but also when I transfer it eventually to the actual project. Instead of using a scraping tool that's designed for this to happen, I used a credit card, and that might seem like a brilliant idea. In my mind, it was a brilliant idea, but it really was not a great idea because I ended up snagging some of that vinyl, and it really ended up just kind of lifting in some areas. It's okay because it ends up getting covered with resin, so it's not going to come off, but I really just wasn't thrilled with the way it looked, and I really wish I had used the right tool. And by the way, I have gone back and I have purchased the right tool. So for future vinyl projects, I will have the tool that I need. I'm using a T-square ruler to make sure that I am getting that word Celebrate centered where I want it in both directions. And then once I have it where I want it to go, I'm going to use tape to help me kind of mark out the edges of that transfer tape so that when I go to place the word down, I know exactly where I want to put it. I've got my tape marking down, and this is where I really regret not having used the proper tool to adhere that transfer sheet to the vinyl, because it just didn't work very well, and it ended up sticking to that backing more than I would have liked, and it took a lot longer. And this is where I was damaging, I think, some of the words a little bit. And I apologize here for the funkiness that's going on with my video recording. I don't know if aliens were getting in the way or what was happening, but it was really messing it up in lots of different ways. So now I'm going to go ahead and lay that down using my guide as much as possible, but I ended up, getting things just a little bit stuck before I wanted them to. I still was super happy with my placement, so all is good. And of course, here's the fun part, and that's removing the transfer tape and seeing the final, well, it's not the final product. There's still some other steps I'm going to do here, but seeing the vinyl on. Once I do that, I'm going to add a few more stars and baubles just to kind of, fill out the design a little bit. And I did that through my scan and cut. I just kind of pulled some of those out and cut just those items. I'll do that in another video if you're interested to show you how I did that, but I'm going to go ahead and get those placed on, and then for the final step, which is the top layer of resin. Now, I wanted that vinyl covered in a layer of resin because I really do want to use this as a tray, as a serving tray. I want to be able to put glasses and that sort of thing, bottles of wine and champagne on it, and use it to take things outside or into the living room. So I really want a nice, clean, and flat surface. And resin is the perfect medium to do that because resin is self-leveling. So as I mentioned earlier, the first time that I did my layer of resin, my very bottom colored layer of resin, I didn't quite make enough. I mean, I just barely had enough to cover the tray in a very, very thin layer. So this time I decided I was going to use enough resin. But that brings me to my next mistake, was that I doubled the amount of resin I was going to do and put it all into this cup, and it was way too full, and it was a mess. It made a literal mess. It was spilling out. It was super hard to stir. I got resin all over my gloves. It would have been much better to do 2 smaller batches in 2 different cups and do it that way. So please learn from my mistake. Took me a while to mix that resin because it was so difficult to do. But once I got it mixed, I pour it on the tray. I'm going to spread it out, get it to where it's fully covering that whole tray. And then I'm going to hit it with the heat gun again to pop all of those bubbles. The heat gun, really, I don't know if it's the heat or if it's the air, what's doing it. I think it has something to do with the heat. It'll pop bubbles that you have. And it can be good to do that and then come back and do it again after maybe 10 minutes as the bubbles start to resurface again. So I think you can see them kind of disappearing there if you look at the vinyl. The bubbles just poof, go away. So overall though, even though I made a lot of mistakes, I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. I absolutely love my final project. I hope you do too, and I hope you come back and watch some of my other videos. If you would like to see more resin videos, hit the like button.